Hello, good morning, good afternoon to every one of you. So welcome to our fifth sessions from the Drone Interest Group from GSMA. Today we have an interesting conversation, and the title is A Race to the Top and Assessing and Accelerated Drone Readiness in UK. So if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to give you a very brief overview what GSMA is doing in this space. So we have a community which is called Advanced Air Mobility. In the community, we have different groups that we look at different aspects on the relation of how the connectivity and the mobile services can support the drone ecosystem. So one group is, as I mentioned before, is the Drone Interest Group, which is primarily hosting this session. The other group is a cooperation with another entity, another association, which is Global UTM Association, in that we try to work very specifically on the connectivity aspect between the work that is relevant for supporting drone ecosystem, drone operator, and the UTM player. I'm not going to go too much into detail, but we also have a different area where we work in events, webinars, this one, projects where we could have foundry and specifically guidance for our members in a working group. If we go to the next slide, please. In here, you will see that we have a different type of resources. All these resources are publicly available, so we will share with you also the link of the page where you can find the information. We have different type of resources, from case study, from webinars, from white papers that are relevant to our members and the broader ecosystem, guidelines, and also news. Here I also want to actually have a call to action to all of you. If you are doing some prototype, your proof of concept trial, or actual commercial operation, which involves some of the services from the mobile network, send it to us. We will send you the link, and please let us know. We want to share as much as possible the news of the industry so that we get to know what is happening, where it's happening. With this one, I want to introduce one of our chairs. So the Drone Interest Group is Alexander Bekaski. Alexander, I give it in the floor to you for introduction and then for the agenda. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thanks everyone for joining, irrespective in which time zone you are today, in which part of the world you are today. We're really excited today. This deep dive session number 5 at the GSMA Drone Interest Group will have a slightly different format. First, we're going to have the presentation from David Pankhurst, who is a part of ETC, one of the subgroups within the British Telecom. He's going to talk to us about BT's A Future with Drones presentation. After that, we're going to have Tim Hatt from GSMA Intelligence covering some aspects of the regulatory readiness and drone readiness with specific focus on the UK. Upon Tim's presentation, we're going to open up the panel where previous speakers, together with Barbara, will be trying to address some of the aspects of the topic today. And at that point in time, only when we start the panel, we're going to be taking the questions from the audience. Thank you very much. Without any further ado, David, please go ahead and thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you for having me as part of this community. So I think first, just to quickly introduce myself. So my name is Dave Pankhurst. I'm BT's Director of Drones. So I'm responsible for building out BT's drone strategy, how we're going to create services, products within this industry, and essentially take them into market and grow our revenue footprint, our customer base, our support for this industry in the United Kingdom. Next slide, please. So for us as an organisation, as Alexander mentioned, being in etc. So etc. is a growth incubation part of BT. It's a commercial unit. We work very closely with our research team that I'll go into, but our focus as a function is looking at some of the longer term growth opportunities for the organisation and how we can mobilise the right amount of internal investment work really effectively with external organisations in terms of partnerships and potential investment to really help the industry move forward, and make sure that we as an organisation have a really important role in it as we go forward. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background, obviously not clear in terms of how familiar everyone is on the audience with the drone industry. So some people know and love a lot of these statistics, other people it may be new to them, but we look at drones in the first place as being a tool for good, a technology that can not only contribute towards saving lives, but also support a number of other pieces that we all want in our society, whether that's a reduction in carbon emissions versus legacy methodologies, whether it's the potential of creating new roles, new growth, new skills that are required, whether that's be in field engineering, in telco itself, in data analytics, a whole host of pieces, and then the potential that it can add value for the economy in terms of those efficiencies and making new services become possible. And we see that across a variety of company types and different types of services. So whether that's organisations that are looking to try and get eyes on incidents and problems where people have got themselves in tricky situations, such as organisations like Lowland Rescue or RNLIs and other organisations that are looking to find people in distress, whether that's organisations like Network Rail and other infrastructure providers, even ourselves as BT with a large amount of infrastructure that needs to be inspected and maintained. How can you utilise this technology to get eyes on environments and over time add in relevant data analytics, but a lot of the time initially, how can you take a person out of a dangerous situation and enable them to have access to the insight without needing to be in a highly difficult environment? Through to organisations, whether it be ports and dockyards or large sort of campus-based environments, where they're potentially looking at a drone to do things such as perimeter surveillance to check if any fences have been damaged overnight. We've even spoken to customers that are looking for oil slicks in the boats in port, through to other pieces. And I'll talk about the NHS and health a little bit more later, but whether that's about point-to-point, rooftop-to-rooftop deliveries of medical goods and potentially larger form factors, which then moves us over to the transportation piece on the right, where there's a number of large drones that will be getting certified over the next 2 to 5 years, which means that we, from a mechanical point of view, we're in a position where people could get in one of these things and go from one part of the city to another. But obviously there's a number of pieces that need to happen before then. And all of these use cases become much more interesting, much more viable, or only viable at the point when a pilot doesn't have to be co-located with that drone, when that drone can be remote, when the service can be automated and enable you to move away from what's referred to as visual line of sight today into beyond visual line of sight of tomorrow, where it suddenly creates new services and new opportunity. Next slide, please. And one thing I would say, and one of the reasons why we're in the etc. unit versus in the core unit, is because we know this isn't easy. We know that there's lots of stakeholders with lots of different needs, lots of different concerns that are part of this industry, whether that be government and regulators. We work and contribute towards some of the innovation work that the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK are doing. We're actively supporting a couple government projects where we're trying to help move some of the technology forward in this space. But we know that there's progress that needs to be made, and obviously Tim and myself from the panel later will focus a little bit more on that. But if I work my way in no particular order, but if I look at airports on this, we've all seen incidents where drone incursions near airports have taken place, but we also know that airports want to use drones, and we also know that they're thinking about the concern and almost how they can support the industry by approving drone flights. People on this call will have their own thoughts about drones in terms of the local communities piece down the bottom, but where we see examples of, we did a survey a couple of years ago, and it was less than 50% of people knew that drones had regulation around them. And when they understood that and understood the purpose of drones, and especially when that purpose was linked to things around search and rescue and health, the support for it was around 70-80%. So there's a big piece there around kind of understanding and people getting more familiar with the technology. And then through to sort of blue light policing, defence, where policing are obviously naturally concerned around the potential impact that bad drone use can cause, and how do you start to think about identity and who these users are, and making that airspace safe. And for ourselves at BT, we are very much focused in this sort of spinny wheel in the middle as to how, if you can get the right blend of airspace flight data, whether that be from the drone or from the ground up, the right forms of traffic management and the right connectivity to bring this together, we should be able to create a situation where we have safe flight for all, versus having to overly segregate the airspace and mean it's a very, very confusing environment for people to operate in. And on the subject of confusion, if you can pop to the next slide, please. We know that this industry is really complex. So this is purposely very challenging to read, but it's a diagram that's provided by an organization called Drone Industry Insights, showing some of the breakdown of the industry. And the reason why I've left it purposely terrible to read isn't because of the quality of the insight, which is very strong, is because it's really complex. It's really hard for organizations to understand. If you're new into wanting to think about using drones, how this is going to work, the regulation that I've touched on, what type of drone company should we work with, what do we need to be successful, how do I start to think about adopting this technology? And that's where we believe as a telco, as BT, we have the ability to work with a number of companies and help make that service easier for end customers to understand, and create a number of the sort of foundational layers to make this more accessible for more people. Next slide, please. And part of it, which I'm sure we'll touch more on sort of within the panel and further conversation, is a bit about why telco, why BT, and we very much look at it through this kind of lens. And I don't ask for forgiveness in terms of not putting exact dates on these things, because we know that the industry is very complex, especially with the regulatory kind of challenges to work through and the technology challenges to make this accessible for all. But right now, there are opportunities for a telco, whether that be around kind of drone detection services, early adopter of connectivity services, initial things around sort of fleet management, those kind of services. But realistically, in that environment where that drone is co-located with an individual, there is limited opportunity for a telco to be involved. Obviously, as we move into the next and later categories, and the way we look at it in terms of these kind of drone superhighways and BVLOS becoming possible, and distributed networks and all this kind of pieces, you start to get into a situation where connectivity is therefore exponentially more relevant. Identity is really relevant. Management of a huge number of assets is. So it starts to form more of an IoT story, which is more familiar for our organizations. And you also then start to think about all of the data IT capability that's coming out from it as well. Sorry, my screen has just died. Sorry, I'm back. I don't know what happened there. So it's really important for us to get involved now, start supporting the industry to be ready for when the regulation is available, and start supporting that journey as we go forwards. Next slide, please. And part of that for us is about testing, validating, proving, learning. We're blessed to have access to a ex-military airbase, where my team are often there testing, validating technology, inviting partners and customers, where we are able then to synthesize a lot of the brilliant organizations that are out there that would love to work with us, and we'd love to work with them, understand more about their capabilities and what works really well and sometimes what doesn't, to help us as a organization that obviously carries a lot of credibility with our end customers, to bring these services together in a way that makes sense for them and for us. And in that environment, we also work really closely with our applied research technology teams to validate new technologies and get our head around what this is going to look like and how can we take this to market effectively. Next slide, please. And for us then, these are the 4 core areas that we're looking at as a business. The one on the left that I'm sure most would be expecting me to talk about is around connectivity. So for us, that's very much about how we can start to internet enable these things that need to be able to transfer data effectively to add the value to the end customers. Whether that be almost like a heartbeat of where that drone is, whether it's a stream of the video feed of that search and rescue mission, whether it's a scan of a perimeter and inspecting if there's damage, whatever that is, we need to start getting these drones internet enabled. Now that can form a number of obviously methodologies to make that happen. I think it's fair to say that right now satellite technology is harder in terms of the form factor required and obviously the payload of the drone. And we are definitely focusing a lot of our attention over the last couple of years on SIM, on cellular connectivity. At the start of this year in the UK, our spectrum regulator, Ofcom, enabled drone operators to apply for a license to start to use cellular at altitude. So that began at the start of January. Because of the work that we'd already begun doing, we were in a position to start to offer trials of a drone sim to a number of our customers and future customers to start using this service and testing it out altitude. Within that, we've done a number of things, understanding more about how a network operates at altitude, the complexities of that environment, which often there's a perception that you won't have coverage at air because the cell towers are often focusing down. But realistically, the almost inverse problem is true, where you sometimes have too much coverage at altitude, which can actually cause an interference issue. And how do you define that in your network and think about the right quality of service to enable those drone operators to have safe missions? Obviously, recognizing that a lot of drones don't have a SIM card slot or an eSIM capability available at an OEM level. So what are the types of drone devices that we would need to support with that and work with organizations that have started to provide remote ID devices, video offload devices onto drones as part of that piece? And there's one example that we've done recently. We're working with an organization called Skyfarer in the UK, who've done an amazing medical trial of delivering medical provisions from one rooftop to another in the middle of England. I think it's about a 32-kilometre range, where they used our connectivity for that to maintain the comms within it, which feeds me onto this bit around the insight and analytics. Whereas part of their safety case, and as we're moving towards needing the drone operator to have more knowledge and insight as to where they have coverage so they can be safe, we were able to provide them in effect a cellular route plan essentially of where they would have effective coverage to perform their mission. So there's a whole big piece there that we're looking at as a business, how we can support from a connectivity point of view. But often, obviously, a lot of my focus is in the air, but on the ground as well, a number of these organizations need mobile solutions to enable them to operate from fields in different locations while they're growing their business. So it's also about the ground as the air as well. On the next category, and from the drone flight, this is one where people may have seen that we as BT have invested in an organization called Altitude Angel. So Altitude Angel are one of the leaders in UTM, Unified Traffic Management. So all about how you start to digitalize the airspace management for drones, how you start to enable, especially when you think about volumes and scale of approvals required, how do you start to help airports and other bodies start to say yes or no, or yes with conditions for drones operating in those airspaces? And as part of that, you've got a blend of that digital management, but also a physical layer. What is the appropriate level of ground-based devices that are listening, watching the sky to understand where's safe to operate, and what can that look like as a network of the future of almost a ground-based detect and avoid system to enable you to understand what's going on in the airspace. And then for organizations like I said, the Heritage 8, the Skyfarers, the Skyports of the world, to operate safely over that and have the blessing from the Civil Aviation Authority. And that's part where a large program that we're working on at the moment is a 165-mile stretch of corridor space that we're attempting to create under a government grant program to prove how this technology can start to come together with infrastructure supported by our mobile network and our fixed line network, connectivity at altitude, a number of IT systems from Altitude Angel to start to enable this industry to thrive. Interlocked with that, a few years ago now, we went into partnership with an Australian manufacturer called Drone Shield. With that, that's around radio frequency detection of drones. So for organizations such as defense, such as airports, stadiums, other kind of critical national infrastructure that have a concern about drones, how can they start to think about what that airspace looks like and apply the right risk mitigation thereafter? So given that early visibility of drones in the airspace that they may wish to take a next action on. And then all that stuff on the left is really about creating a lot of the underlying building blocks to enable organizations to use drones appropriately, for organizations to have more visibility of where drones are and what they need to do. The one on the right then is very much from us as an organization in terms of what are the drone exploitation services, those drone operator services that we can do as a business, whether that's looking at piloted services initially and how we can use potentially even our own field service engineers to use drones on our own infrastructure. How can we start to have a think about what that looks like in terms of getting the value from drones, through to these kind of automated drone stations, these drones in boxes that can pop out and go to predefined waypoints and start to conduct missions in a routine, repeatable way and get value from that data for organizations on hard to reach sites, on sites where there's lots of repeatable use, and start to complement existing IoT stories that we have as a business and start to take that up in the sky to start to use drones as part of that end-to-end story. So what we're really keen to do is work within these categories to find organizations that offer brilliant services and then bring these things together intelligently so that companies can start to utilize drones end to end and start to get the value from this. Obviously, like I said earlier, a huge part of that though is gaining trust and confidence, whether that be in terms of our immediate customers and the broader environment from a regulatory point of view, and how we can start to help build out some of those building blocks to mean that more people can kind of get up in the sky and start using this technology safely. And I think, unless there's another slide that I've forgotten about, I think that's the end of my little bit.
Thank you very much, Dave, for this thorough view of ETCETRA's or BT's on presence, future, and long-distance future of the drones, aerial drones as you're seeing it. We'll get back to you with some questions, I'm certain, in a panel discussion. Right now, I'd love to introduce Tim Hatt from GSMA Intelligence. He's gonna talk about the title is Drones Poised for Liftoff, but it's really giving a little bit of view of regulatory readiness across different regions and some goods and bads about the regulatory readiness in UK. Tim, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alexander and Dave, and thank you very much for having me here today. So yeah, I'm Tim Hatt. I work with the GSMA Intelligence Group, which is the analyst arm of the GSMA. And in that capacity, we have a published research agenda which covers many topics, but drones has become an important part of that agenda for a number of reasons, a lot of which Dave alluded to, but really kind of fundamentally because it's part of the 4G and 5G monetization angle, as well as drones being a key part of digital economies across the world. We recently partnered with BT to publish some research that looked at the readiness for the drone sector overall as well as regulation specifically, kind of comparing and benchmarking leading countries. And what I wanted to do in this sort of short presentation is go over some of the key findings from that. And really, more than the numbers, look at the value of that index to policymakers as they go forward and look at what is needed to do from their perspective to help, the drone market scale up. So if we can go to the next slide. I think the first point of context, which, Dave touched on as well, is that drones have moved from being sort of a niche thing to a more widespread technology. When drones were first sort of introduced several years ago, in the commercial context, a lot of it focused on site maintenance, reconnaissance, defense sector applications, not necessarily applications that you and I would be affected by or could take advantage of. But that's really changed, and a lot of it comes down to kind of a technology story that has improved. There's better economics. There is a better set of sort of ecosystem participants to get the business models in play. And that's reflected in these numbers, which is sort of survey data pointing to which industries, see drones as a positive sort of solution for some of their applications. You still have traditional site monitoring and maintenance, oil and gas and these mining and so forth. But if you look on down the list, you see, urban planning applications in smart cities. You see construction, you see live events, emergency response, a whole host of deployment venues for which the benefits come in terms of productivity gains. They come in terms of safety mitigation, and they come in terms of ultimately for a country and economic impact. When we look at 5G overall, our forecast is that that'll add 4 to 5 percentage points to GDP cumulatively this decade. But there's a lot of upside in that forecast when you think about the sort of digital economy growth and drones being a big part of that. And I think, the 45 billion pounds that Dave cited for the UK impact from drones by 2030, that's a significant portion of the country's GDP. It's a job creation engine. And a lot of these arguments are really sort of auguring towards this becoming a more scalable space. So next slide. That's good context. And I think that's the reason for a lot of the momentum we've seen. But the kind of but is that when you look at people, when you ask people, what is sector participants, what do you see as the main barriers to future success? So we know all the factors pointing in favor of drones. We've gone over those. But what do you see as the main barriers? And sort of you look across, is it the market being ready? Is the technology there? Is it the money? Is there a sort of public acceptance point? Ultimately, regulation is coming out in our survey data and others as the key sticking point. And that isn't to say that regulation is a bad thing in principle. It's not that. It's that there's a lack of a clear regulatory framework. And that was sort of the impetus for undertaking this analysis that we did with BT, this cross-country comparison, because we wanted to understand, if you were looking at a scaled drone sector, what are the most important regulatory categories that a government and its associations and offices need to address? And that you come down and you get quite a sort of clear picture that correlates with leading nations in drones having further regulatory progress. And that comes through beyond the visual line of sight flight. It comes through traffic management systems, identification, connectivity protocols, a whole range of things that are necessary for the ecosystem to coalesce and for drone sector participants to understand so that they can build out business models that will work at scale. So this is a glass half full and a glass half empty story. And we think there is a lot of opportunity to close some of those regulatory gaps in the UK and some other countries that have a lot of progress, but can still make further gains. So if we can go to the next slide. When you do an index, I think one of the things we want to show is the current position of countries that we compared on their overall market readiness, as well as regulation specifically. So let me take those each in turn. There were 12 countries in the comparison set. You can see by the national flags below, a smattering of countries within the EASA framework in Europe, of course, the UK, the rest of the G7, and then a few other countries, particularly Switzerland and Singapore, that have made gains in drones and made it a national priority. Sort of key takeaways: the UK sits middle of the pack. Switzerland is actually the global leader, and then the European EASA markets closely follow that. The US and Canada are a little bit further behind. This is really down to the EASA markets in Switzerland having, as I mentioned, more developed regulatory frameworks, the permittance of BV loss, as well as some of the network infrastructure categories that help further drone scale. I think from the UK's perspective, and we'll talk about this more in the panel, this is a very dynamic index. It's not meant to be static. And so we would expect to see these positions change as regulations come into effect. And I think part of the point we wanted to make is that there is a time window to act here. There is still time, but that window will close as investments is concentrated in countries where the rules are clear and where they are aligned, so that you can operate across multiple jurisdictions and have scale. So if we can go to the next slide. That was the overall market readiness ranking, which takes into account not just regulations, but a country's infrastructure position on telecoms and technology, its economic power, and the demand from industry for drones. That was that index. This is what you're looking at here is specifically drones on regulation. And you see broadly a similar comparison, albeit different, obviously, absolute numbers. And I think that the takeaways are that, I mentioned that the EASA countries have, brought in BV loss, some of the conspicuity regulations, and have gotten to a point where these have been implemented in a common method across the countries. The UK has done that in some regulations, but not in others. And so within the beyond the visual line of sight, the policy is in place, but there is a lack of clarity in some quarters about how to implement it. And so when we kind of boiled this down as why does this matter and what set of actions can policymakers in the UK take from this research, as well as other countries, there were a number of points. And one, I just briefly summarized those below. There's, an importance of regulators working alongside industry participants to formulate regulations. Ultimately, when you're talking about permissive regulation or innovation, you need to have, regulation that fits with a pro-innovation and a pro-investment climate that fosters safety, but is ultimately long looking forward. It's not just drones. You see this in artificial intelligence now and other parts of the tech industry. Regulatory alignment is a key point, where possible, to have alignment of rules across national boundaries to permit scale of operations. In other words, operating in multiple countries. But ultimately there is this time window where, to take advantage of all of the economic opportunities that drones afford, we think there's sort of a 12 to 24 month window of opportunity to act. When you look at, and the reason for that is both because that's when drone sector participants expect commercial scale to occur by or to have materialized by. It also coincides with when 5G new radio standards start to get into standalone networks. And basically that brings in a whole bunch of technology capabilities that can really supercharge what drones can do, particularly in enterprise settings. So there is a window to act, and we think that's really important to take advantage of. I did include QR codes with this on the slide, so please, the report that I'm talking about is freely available, and we would encourage you to take a look at that, at your leisure, and you can of course get in touch with us anytime to go into questions you may have, and I'm sure we'll talk about these issues in the panel. Next slide, please. Just quickly before I close, this is just a little bit about us. You can look at this in your own time. But as I say, we are with GSMA Intelligence and cover across the sector. But this is a really great topic that we're writing and doing a lot of analysis on. So, Alexander, I will close there and hand back to you, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to go into these issues in more detail.
Thank you very much, Tim, for this thorough presentation and a GSMA Intelligence report on drones readiness and regulation, with specific focus on UK. I'm already starting to see some of the questions coming in related to that, which is good. So with this, I would love to switch gears a little bit and turn the rest of our, I think it's almost 50 minutes, which is more than we were originally planning for. I appreciate the conciseness of the presenters. It's the panel, and we will have Barbara Barrego as a Smart Mobility Lead for GSMA with us on it. Dave and Tim, who were already presenting their points of view from their respective organizations. Thank you very much, everyone, for being available for this panel today. So I'd love to start with a little bit of a personal question to Dave. When did you start to look at drones? How easy or difficult was the journey to where you are now?
So pre-etc. I was working in another part of BT, which was looking at new growth initiatives for the organisation. And there's a very smart chap called Mark Potton who went, "Oh, this drones thing, more telcos are starting to look at this. We think this is something that we should look at." And fast forward 4 years, and here we are, kind of thing in terms of it. But so it's been about 4 years in terms of building up the interest and engagement within the organisation, learning from some peers internationally that have had success in terms of looking at what are the right things that we should be looking at as a telco. In some regions now we're a little bit further ahead, others further behind in terms of what we're doing, but it's great to have peers across the telco industry. But yeah, about 4 years now. So in some contexts, I'm very new to the aviation industry, and in others, I'm almost an old hat with some of these startups starting up every week and a blend in between.
Thank you very much. I have one more for you. Do you actively engage with regulators in civil aviation still today? Can you share some of your experiences and some of the learnings that you want to share with the auditorium here today?
Yeah, absolutely. So we directly or indirectly through our partners have been engaging in projects with the Civil Aviation Authority. If I start with them, and then I'll talk about Ofcom from a regulatory point of view. So we've done a number of projects either in the government grant space or us as BT looking to get up in the sky. So as BT, we have an operations manual as an organisation to use drones. So there's a number of drone pilots within the business. In my team, which is now a team of about 12, 15 people, roughly speaking, I think 10 of them have got their GVC qualifications, are able to operate drones, which is obviously important in our testing. And as part of that, obviously has the relevant engagement with the CAA. I think what's really critical and important for us is going through some of those processes ourselves, so we know what our customers are facing in terms of getting drones up in the sky, and what the operators that we want to provide services into are facing as well, and therefore what are the things that we can do to try and reduce some of the pain essentially that they're going through. What we found traditionally is that the innovation arm of the CAA, especially over the last year, has been really forthcoming, interested to learn. I think in the last 6 months, there's definitely been a step up in the interest that mobile networks and cellular can provide in the industry. It feels like there's been a bit of a shift essentially in that thinking. And I know, I'm sure we'll get onto a question about remote ID and other pieces in time as well. But yeah, I think for us it's mixed, as is in the industry. We know realistically the moment you talk about beyond visual line of sight, that you're a minimum of 3 months, 6 months to 2 years of conversation to make things move. But we know that the regulator wants to improve, so does the Department of Transport. And super quickly, because I don't want to take over the entire call, from an Ofcom point of view, I think it's fair to say that Ofcom for a while, and apologies if anyone from Ofcom is listening to this and think I'm misrepresenting, was watching with interest for a period of time and waiting almost for an inflection point where there was enough demand from industry and enough comfort from telco to start to actually go, right, let's flip the switch and let's start to enable organizations to use cellular altitude with conditions. So what I didn't reference earlier is that the license, an operator is responsible for making sure they can't communicate on the 2600 megahertz range because there's concern about existing ground-to-air comms. But it's great that Ofcom have kind of allowed the industry to move forward, but putting in some mitigations until they're more confident of the technical environment. But that's been a really lovely approach to see in the market.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. And one more item for yourself. You communicated what etc. as and British Telecom's our next step. What will be your own kind of next steps in this journey?
So, yeah, if I was doing one thing, that would be very easy to answer. I think that logically the next step for us in terms of some of the things that we're taking to market will be definitely around the connectivity piece, how we can start to move that from a trial with brilliant learnings that we've had from 40, 50 organizations, whether it's that we're supporting in that, through to a more standardized service to start to help those companies. While in parallel, a huge focus for us is how can we accelerate pace at which the UK can start to adopt drones in a BVLOS sense. And that's why we're on the call today. That's one of the reasons why we've been working with the GSMA. How can we break the cycle of tiny little steps that don't fundamentally take you forward, and how can we kind of, with the right technology and with the right people, help accelerate the industry? That's what I'd love to do.
Thank you very much, Dave. Tim, I guess this next one might be for you. From your perspective, why does regulation matter for the drone success? Isn't this mostly about just the better technology meeting industry demands?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think the regulation matters because it sets the playing field everybody operates on. Ultimately, the technology is what powers the solutions that we're talking about here. But you need a playing field that people understand and can operate safely and scalably on. And I think, building on what Dave said, the interesting things from the countries we looked at in this comparison is that there is a story that when regulation is in place that allows drones to fly beyond the line of sight, the industry is taking off and people are ready to unleash a lot of the investment that is there and being put in place for this technology. But ultimately that regulation, be it BVLOS, be it in conspicuity, be it in the traffic management systems are needed as the sort of underlying bedrock that people operate on. And the risk is that if that is not in place, that you get a delay to the sector's development. So it is an important piece. It is an important piece of the puzzle.
Thank you. Looking through your presentation, Tim, I kind of think that the auditorium would love to see a little bit more about what are the criteria, how did you choose them to create the readiness index for the report?
Yeah, I mean, I can start on this, and then Barbara is welcome to chip in as well. I mean, I think when we look at these categories of BB-LOS, conspicuity, connectivity, remote ID, they're the categories that consistently are required for successful drone flight in all of these countries. They're required for safety, and they can be tracked. And so when we look at what different regulators are looking at around the world, whether they've implemented it or are looking at it, it often comes down to the consistency of these categories. And we wanted to be able to compare like against like, rather than just saying one country is further ahead because it's, for example, had more drone flights or something like that. And ultimately what we want to do with this index is maintain it over time and add more countries to see see how it changes as new regulations are brought in.
Okay, thank you. Dave, for yourself, I guess question would be, why has British Telecom done this research that team presented with the GSMA Intelligence today? What was really the intent of your organization behind it?
So I think many reasons to some extent. So I think there's been lots of papers, conversations into the governmental policy regulatory environment, which have attempts to create kind of actions and next steps and those kind of pieces. And it's hard sometimes to add value in terms of saying, well, what could we do in what scenario, and what are other people doing that we can benefit from, and there is a different lens on this, which is one of the ones that kind of concerns me when I work with lots of startups, is that we sometimes forget, as per this very call, that we operate internationally as a globe, and a number of these companies are deploying really intelligent things. They're full of really skilled people. And if the regulation in the UK environment doesn't move aligned with their need, the need of their venture capitalist backers, their own sort of bootstrapping, funding themselves, or whatever that looks like, or when we get to a point where the matched funding government projects start to finish, if the regulatory environment isn't there, those organizations are going to have to make some very hard decisions. And one of those decisions is, do we continue to operate in the United Kingdom, or do we look at Switzerland, Japan, America, wherever it may well be, to start operating in regions where potentially regulation is more aligned with where they are? So for us, part of it was, how can we create a little bit more of an international context and start to help the UK government almost have a bit of a moment maybe of clarity and thinking in terms of, actually, this isn't just about the regulation and us wanting to move forward. This is a bigger problem, that if things don't move in the next 2 to 4 years, a lot of that skill and that investment will leave the UK and go elsewhere. And then we've potentially got a gap then for 4 to 6 years before trust comes back into the UK, all these companies prove elsewhere enough money to come back in again. So if you don't get it right in the next 2 years, you might not be able to get it right for another 6, essentially. And so we're really keen to find a way of expressing that. And I think it's very clear that the work that GSMA have done has put us in a really good place of being able to do that.
Thank you, Dave. Tim, looking through your report, it seems that there are a few countries, Switzerland and some of the EU members, that came way ahead in the readiness index compared to the UK. Do you have some explanation for that?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons. And I just repeat the caveat, which is important. I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but this is a dynamic index. It's fluid, so it can change over time. But what we see right now is the European countries have laid down most of the regulations with a high degree of sort of clarity across a common marketplace. So that's one reason, I think, why the EASA countries, so Germany, France, Finland is aligned to it, Switzerland as well, perform very well in the readiness. When you look at some countries outside of the Europe area, Korea, even though it scores quite low, it's moving quickly. Finland, as outside the immediate commission area, and even Singapore, they have developed quite a far-sighted approach to regulatory alignment with the industry. So some of the examples, we talk about in the report are test beds where, mobile operators and other drone participants can interact with startups, and where the regulatory community has actually worked sort of hand in glove to test whether regulations that are proposed work in action. And so that's why we came back to this point of needing alignment between what regulations are in place and what works for industry. So I think that sort of ecosystem and regulatory alignment is another point. And then finally, there is just a pragmatic point that some of these countries have acted quicker than the UK. When you look at Japan as a good example, Japan put in place a drone plan 4 years ago that it wasn't going to be done overnight, but they laid out a very methodical approach of how to lay down the regulations that would underpin the market certainty. And you're starting to see that sort of reflected in the success they've had. And, so I come back again to echo Dave's point, there is a window of opportunity. And of course, government agencies and regulators need to take their time to make sure what's put in place is safe and it's sustainable. But in the current global environment, particularly with the UK having Brexited and sitting on its own outside the EU, time is not on the country's side. And so there is an urgency that we wanted to stress here. There's a great base to build on, but there is an urgency to get this into place for the UK to catch up and surpass some of these countries, because it does have a ton of good stuff going on.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to kind of Barbara to feel disengaged. Maybe we can start off with one question from the audience here related to the UK's approach to remote ID for drones. In the UE, there are some mandatoriness coming in starting from January 2024. What's the situation in the UK, and how is CAA looking into that? Maybe you can start, and then if they have some perspective to add on after your comments.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
So, and there is also another question pretty much related to that. So, as the team has already hinted, there's been a time was not, let's say, in favor of UK because of moving from the EASA, so detaching the civil aviation, not following the completed rules. So they had to assess the strategy, what was the primary interest. The strategy of the civil aviation was to not adopt initially remote identification. They focused primarily on the effort of the conspicuity. They wanted to create a safe airspace where practically there is all conspicuous. So And it's been some challenges to try to go down fully to that route. And even now you see that compared to the other framework, that they also think about the U-space or the UTM. It's not yet clear when and if the civil aviation will think of having that as a framework from the civil aviation, because, as I said, the primary goal is to have these safe aspects with different technology, which one of the technologies, conspicuity, detect and avoid, could be. And the other one now is quite new, is the remote identification. The remote identification, the civil aviation announced recently that they are going to implement it. They had some initial thoughts and then doing the work. So they are currently on a stage of the definition. They had last week, I believe, some meeting with different stakeholders from the UK industry, but it could be from manufacturer, like us, also from the telco, but all stakeholders to listen to them. What are the possibility and how to implement it, looking also the alignment with other countries. So if I remember well, the plan is that they should have something ready for September 2023, which means obviously compared to the framework or the implementation, or actually the entry into market and implementation in Europe, we have this delay. Having something like a design ready in 2023, then it probably we will see a consultation from the civil aviation either the end of the year or the beginning of next year. So you can understand that then the actual deployment implementation will be probably at the end of 2024. So as I said, this is maybe not accurate, so it's not clear yet the timeline. But we are at the beginning of the phase of looking at the remote identification. I don't know, Dave, if you have more details or different views on what is happening.
No, very, very, very similar. I think, just to pick up a couple bits, a little bit to what Tim said. I can't remember at what point in the drafting or sign-off stage of the report that you guys did, and then within a couple of weeks, the CAA published 2 RFIs on remote ID. To very much to your point, Tim, it's always a dynamic document essentially, and yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of the RFI that has come out, the sort of the main one, it's definitely looking at the communication layer between the drone and an integration provider layer. So how can you get the remote ID from the drone to a platform in its simplest form, and questions over whether that is through almost, but I confess that the language of it sometimes confuses me, coming from a telco background where it talks about a network remote ID being done almost through local Bluetooth and Wi-Fi beacons, whereas my head says network ID is over my mobile network, but that's semantics. And then they talk about then a direct remote ID, which is then over the mobile network, essentially through the back end. So I think that's really positive. That's a really good sign that they're looking at how you need to communicate that information successfully to support the drone industry. From an integration provider point of view, then it's definitely about how can you create a system to mean that multiple connectivity providers, remote methods can come back to the same place, and able to facilitate that on behalf of the UK. So these are some of the building blocks which, if you want to create a more data-driven airspace, is really important to have. I think then we get on to maybe this does link in with like electronic conspicuity kind of challenges and those kind of pieces as well, as to who is going to have the burden of the physical profile of the drone, the change to it. Is it a hook-on device? Is it the OEM implementing changes in the way that they broadcast? Who's going to support, in effect, getting that information out from the drone? And where's the burden of cost to take part in this industry? and what is the volume of information required for the Civil Aviation Authority to feel comfortable that they know enough about what's happening in the airspace to start to enable more things to fly remotely or through automated measures. And I don't think we know what that looks like yet, but this is a big first step of kind of helping that industry move forward.
Thank you, Dave and Barbara. Actually, just yesterday here in Canada, we have a conversation with our Civil Aviation Authority kind of drone group when they were stating remote ID is kind of blended in services within a UTM. And few of us coming from non-aviation 20-year brainwashing type of things stated, well, not really. We feel the remote ID can be a standalone services in some instances and probably can be commercially ready much earlier than the rest of the digital conspicuity umbrella. Simply because we feel that the regulations around that are much simpler than the BV laws and the UTM regulations. So it was a kind of food for thought. Hopefully by the next call, that's going to be addressed. The point here is with our telcos hats, we want to kind of use that as an advantage to help the regulators regarding enabling us for the commercialization of the services that may not all come with the same dynamics related to drones. Okay, thank you, Barbara and Dave. Tim, while doing the readiness report, you probably have to take a 10,000 feet view as well over MNO's interests and roles into the UAV space. So can you comment a little bit, what are your thoughts? How do you see an MNO's role and interest regarding the drones?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the telco operator interest, MNO interest, comes in a number of ways, but most fundamentally, it's to take advantage of another use case for its network infrastructure, and to help drive a return on investment for that. I think there's a point when you look ahead with the sort of digitization movement across the economy that, drones, as we touched on at the top of the presentation, are now kind of a viable contributor to that, or potential contributor. And where an operator is able to, provide either connectivity and or services in the drone marketplace, that can be a really positive thing. I think one of the interesting points, BT is a good example. You see it with other operators as well. Like, they also can play a sort of orchestration role between different layers of the industry, and help bring together startups with, capital providers, with incubators, to sort of align that technology development. And I think we see a lot of applications in other parts of the world, like China, Korea, Japan, Singapore, where drones have been taken out from that sort of pilot stage to commercial stage and are a key part of the sort of 5G digital economy. Mining installations. I was on a call with a separate provider this morning, walking us through case studies of how they're using drones for kind of whole inspections of enormous offshore energy installations like wind farms, as well as more traditional mining and precision agriculture, which is being seen as a major sort of win for those operators, as it should be. And so I think the proof points are there. It's a case of just having again the regulations in place and operators being able to bring those services to market, and we hope to see that. We think we will see it, just at varying paces.
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate it. Can you comment first, Dave, and then Tim, a little bit about what is the opportunity for MNOs in the drone space, and what is the opportunity for UK as a country in the drone space from your perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, I think very similar maybe to what Tim was talking through there. I think at a minimum, I think it's around the connectivity piece at an absolute minimum. We know as the market moves forwards, there's a gap essentially in terms of how are you going to get the data from that thing that's flying around back to where you need it to get the value from that asset. That's a very traditional gap essentially in terms of what a telco can fill. Now, it doesn't mean it's not complex and that there aren't new challenges and new network dimensions that we need to think about, but it is the most obvious thing that you can do as a telco. From there on, I think it really depends as to a little bit in terms of where the regulatory environment is within the region that the telco operates, but also about aspiration and risk, essentially. So theoretically, do you believe in a world in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, where there will be multiple drones operating, different companies operating them in a similar environment? And what are the things that are going to be needed to make that true? And the more you step into that space, the more you look at it and you go, actually, there is likely to be a reliance on physical infrastructure to put stuff on things, whether that be the drones itself, whether it be new types of receivers, new network components, where you're in effect going, hey, as a telco today, we operate our fixed networks, our mobile networks, and we have some sensors on things. Now we need new sensors for drones. So it just becomes another infrastructure requirement to enable an industry to thrive. And so you can do it connectivity, then infrastructure. And then I think it's fair to say that most telcos internationally are looking at new growth and data and analytics and software and service and digital experiences. And then at the end of the day, this thing that's flying around is an enabler for all of those things. And then it depends, as a telco, do you want to be part of your customer's digital journey? Do you want to be part of how they're starting to use data to be more efficient and more effective? And I know a huge number of telcos have all got their data teams and analytics teams and building products and software services. Do you want to do it yourself or partner? We do a blend. It's really extensive, and in the UK, that's very true of what we'll do. There's a lot of opportunity in this space. It just depends. How far into it do you want to go as an organization?
Thank you, Dave. This is quite kind of inclusive and broad view. Tim, anything to top up or comment on the same topic that Dave just elaborated on?
I mean, I think I'd echo that. I think there's certainly drones are part of operators' pushes for growth in new areas and the ROI I mentioned on the network investments. I guess, the other thing that's interesting is just almost from a historical context, it's interesting to look at what role an operator can play in the drone industry compared to how, telcos have tried to play in other categories beyond connectivity before. And I think there's a sort of lesson to be learned there about getting in early and being aligned with the rest of the market. When you look at past forays into some of the areas, they haven't always sort of been successful. And be that in content, be that in kind of video in some cases. But what's been good is that I think many operators have understood that there is a partnering aspect to go forward with and leverage what you do best. And I think in drones, the same is true, but where operators have actually gotten involved a lot earlier here and are helping shaping the future. So let's see where it goes. But there, as Dave said, there's a lot of positive opportunities. I think we'll need to see some more clarity on the business models and the revenue models as they come through. And I do think there's still a lot of service launches that we haven't seen yet, and companies that we haven't yet seen in the drone space, logistics companies, Uber, people that are involved in other aspects of transportation that may also enter this space and provide further kind of partnership opportunities.
Yeah. If I may just quickly, you just inspired a thought where you're talking in the middle in terms of that partnership, and I was thinking in terms of the broader piece around what does a telco represent in most regions they operate. It is a critical national infrastructure provider that is often one of the most trusted organizations in the countries that it operates in terms of the uptime of its service, often the social good things that it enables and is close to within the country it operates in. And you've got regulators in the broader sense, and I might be stereotyping and being very generic here, but I'll go for it, that are very evidence-based, are very historically trust-based, and like to know that the service is going to work because they're pegged against their safety record. You've then got a huge number of incredibly talented and capable startups with no history of safety, like historical, that's unfair, but as in like long tenure of safety, that are having to prove moment by moment that they can be safe and they can operate, but they haven't got 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And now that could be argued as that optic is unfair, because how can they achieve that without existing? But in the same respect, if you are looking at creating critical national infrastructure for scaled use, I think, to use, Tim, your word like partnering, I think there's potentially a really nice balance to give the regulator and kind of governmental groups confidence that a safe organization that feels regulatory burden, has lived with that pressure, understands the commitment that that entails, can then benefit and work with these amazing startups that have technology that they've been specializing in. If you can bring that together well, I think telcos can be really well positioned to support those startups and the regulator move this environment forward. I think if telcos just try to go on their own, they're at risk of going down a wormhole of 7 to 10 years of research and development, and we're trying to catch up with these startups and not delivering the things that really matter. And I think if startups go on their own, I think they'll get to a point when they can't go further because they haven't got that regulatory burden that telcos have carried for years to help support the next stage of their business. So I think partnership is such a massive word in this industry.
Good point. Thank you both Tim and Dave for commenting on this question. Next one will be probably for Barbara, but the rest of you feel free to chip in. Although understanding that each country is a sovereign on regulations over their own country territory, where is ICAO work on UAV fits?
So yeah, thanks for the question. So the as you indicated, so the ICAO is for the people that are more from the telco, I guess, and not from the aviation. The ICAO can be considered the ITU of the aviation. So they are the primary entity, which is under the UN, and also regulate the skies, so to say, the operations and for the traditional aviation. So we're talking about all the airlines, the general aviation. So everything is under the rule of ICAO. What ICAO is doing is being involved in a drone for quite a long time. So I believe since I started, so it's almost 7 years ago, ICAO was already looking at this area, or maybe longer. One of the approach of ICAO, which I believe is also correct, is not to start standardizing or defining rules even before having some knowledge of what it was possible and looking around of what the different national authority they were doing. So there was more conversation rather than go enforcing or defining some rules. But I have a dedicated group also, which is under the Drone Enable, I believe it's called, where they look at the different topics and they try to define some structures, some guidelines on different area. I believe they already have seen or looked at the UTM. What is the UTM? What it can do with the UTM, what are the services and different architectures. Now they're looking at more what is the connectivity, navigation, and surveillance aspect. So one primary topic where we fit in perfectly, talking about traditional connectivity for C2 link, but also for remote ID and for other things, or navigation is also the conspicuity or the detect and avoid, etc. So these are the type of things that they're looking at now, and they do it more in an open way to collect the input from the different industry, try to then feed back to the group itself and provide some references. Again, I would say that they're ready to go down the route of the regulation, but it's more try to provide some guidance.
Yeah.
As I said, waiting a little bit. And they just opened up recently something on the advanced or urban air mobility. So they also look at there how the UTM interact with this type of aircrafts, which are slightly different than what we have now. So that is where they have. But as I said, I follow a little bit more from the outside, try to see what is happening. So I'm not directly involved, but so the next thing that I know is a journal enable happening in December where they collect the industry input.
Thank you very much, Barbara. There's still a lot of questions from the auditorium, but we probably, from the time perspective, have time for one more, and I will pose it to Dave. Dave, if other MNOs want to start their commercial journey related to aerial drones, what would you recommend to them?
What I recommend is quite a path, is how I describe it. So I think it's recognizing that there is risk. I think Tim mentioned about business models. There is a lack of clarity in terms of at what point different parts of this can be monetized and by who and what would those models look like. So there is an element here of it is a riskier category for a telco to invest in than other existing pieces. So I'm sure for other telcos and people looking at innovation in their areas, you're essentially competing against rolling out more 5G, rolling out more fiber, whatever that looks like for your organization. So to start to go down this path, it does rely on getting the right advocacy internally within your organization to create a path. And that path cannot be 1 month, 3 months, 6 months. You're talking 2 to 5 years of runway to give you a chance to get the right resources and skills, build the right relationships and the knowledge, and to start to test and validate in the market. For us, I said it's taken us 4 years to get to this point. And that's been a blend of trialing different services, building up relationships, starting to work within the industry so that they recognize the value that a telco can provide, building relationships with regulators. But a huge part of it is, at the end of the day, it's internal sponsorship. So do your networks team believe that what you're going to do isn't going to crash the entire mobile network and mean that none of their existing customers, where the majority of the revenue comes in your business, is going to be affected? So how do you convince the networks teams and then peers either in like the consumer arms and the business arms? How do you get the right sponsorship for that? And then, like I said earlier, if you then want to start building out these other services, how do you then in your local region start to think about, well, I think where we talk about in the use space category is such like who are the kind of UTM providers going to be in that space, and who are those ones that you can start to build those relationships with to understand what your role could be and what that could look like. But I think a big part of it is looking at this as a long-term objective, because being blunt, if you try and make money from this as a telco within a year of having this conversation, you are doing incredibly well, and pat on the back to you. This has to be looked at as a long-term structural decision as the business, to go down. That has risk, but potentially has a huge reward for the telco and for the drone industry.
Thank you very much, Dave. With this, I would love to thank the panel participants today. There are unanswered questions. I'm not sure, Barbara or Dan, can we address them offline with those that post them and close the loop on it? I'm really glad to see that we were actually running out of time and have still unanswered stuff. This was really, really interesting discussion. It seems from the auditorious reaction, certainly personally for me, it was very much enjoying. With that, I'd love to kind of hand it to Barbara and Justin for some of the wrap up stuff. We have 10 more minutes to go. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you for that. So I just want to then give it to Justin, but just to indeed let you know, we will look at all the questions that are not answered. We try to answer it on LinkedIn or privately. We will see, and we're also going to make available the recording. Will be still on demand, so you can go and have a look. But now I want to give it to Justin just to give it an overview of the membership.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you to all the speakers. It's been a really interesting session. I'm pretty sure everyone agrees with me on that. I'm just going to take a few minutes of your time just at the end of this call to give you an overview of GSMA membership. You've heard of the drone interest group mentioned a few times during the presentation, and the only way to really access the drone interest group is by becoming a GSMA member. So I'm really going to cover kind of what the membership is, and there's different ways that you can go about this as an organization as well. There's a few membership categories that you can see here. So the main category that we've always had is our operator members. These are for our MNOs, for example, BT and TELUS, that you've had speaking with yourselves today. We also have our Rapporteur memberships for our NVNOs as well. The important categories that you can see on the screen here are our industry membership. So these are for companies that sit within the mobile ecosystem. These could be handset and device manufacturers, software companies that focus on fraud and security, or internet companies. So there is a huge variety of these that sit within our industry members. There's no real limit on who can be involved in these groups. We also have our sector membership, which is slightly different. And this is for anyone that sits adjacent to these ecosystems or that have an interaction within mobile, but maybe don't sit in directly kind of your traditional telco. This covers different parts like smart mobility, that also encompasses our drones, aviation, and automotive areas as well. Next slide, please. So our membership is really there to drive innovation across the whole industry. This can be really just to focus on help shaping the future, but also really focusing on different pieces of work that we're doing across telco, but for you guys, more across drones and aviation. All this work that we focus on is completed across our working groups. We've got 8 fixed working groups that all of our members can be involved in, and they cover different areas. For example, we have our terminal steering working groups that's focusing on automotive identity. We also have our eSIM group that is there to kind of draft requirements and specifications for different parts of eSIMs, all the way through from kind of the beginning of the life cycle to the end. Across the 8 fixed working groups, our industry members can access them all, and everyone at their organization can take part in all the activities that are happening. These groups are very active across the GSMA. Most of them are having meetings almost every day, if not every week. And they also host 2 physical events a year, one normally in Europe and one normally in North America, which now we also have hybrid access to these events. You can also probably see on the screen there as well, there's a few other benefits to becoming a GSMA member. There's lots of different parts that we like to add to making sure that you feel fully encompassed and housed within our GSMA kind of relationship across the board as well. Next slide, please. Our sector membership is slightly differently to our industry membership. So our smart mobility sector membership allows you access just into kind of our automotive and aerospace and drone groups that we have. For example, our drone interest group. We also understand that a lot of these companies that will be joining these groups will be smaller, and therefore the cost and contribution for sector membership is less. We really want to make sure we provide opportunities for our sector members to grow as companies and be involved in these conversations as much as possible. Members have the opportunity to join these conversations and networking opportunities throughout different industries. They can speak and collaborate with the MNOs, OEMs, or suppliers and really start building these connections within their industry. We also will provide different platforms, again, for members to start networking with each other, logistics, and also support them at different events such as MWC that you guys may or may not have been to. Next slide, please. The industry membership, one of the probably the downsides on this call is that it's going to take me a full day to run through kind of all the intricacies and all the benefits that we have as industry members. These are kind of just a few of the main ones. Everything is really facilitated around our working groups, but there's lots of other different ways to get involved once you're a GSMA member. Next slide, please. To find out any more, please feel free just to contact me directly, or you can email drones@gsma.com if you want to find a bit more about what the drone interest group is doing as well. Thank you very much, guys, for giving me your time.
Thank you, Justin. So Barbara, I'll leave you to close off today's deep dive session.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for being very good and ask all the questions. Again, please get in touch with us if you have any question or you want to learn more about some of the area. So we will have a regular session like this one. Also, let us know if there is anything particular that you are interested to learn more in relation, obviously, to the work that we do within GSMA and our stakeholder. Again, thank you very much. This session is going to be still available on demand, so you can watch it back and get more information. After a while, we will also post it and make it available on our website, so it will be always there for you. Again, a pleasure and thank you to our speakers, Alexander and Justin. So thank you. See you next time.